The night my father threw me out, he did not raise his hand to hit me. He did something worse. He opened the front door of our Charleston mansion, tossed my life into the rain in 2 canvas bags, and told me the ocean could swallow me for all he cared. I was 18 years old, soaked through in a white dress my mother had once said made me look brave. Standing barefoot on the marble steps while thunder cracked above the Whitaker estate, and my father, Preston Whitaker, looked at me as if I were not his daughter but a stain he had finally found the courage to scrub away. 23 years later, people would stand in a room full of admirals, senators, and millionaires to honor my name. But that night, the only sound I heard was my brother Graham laughing quietly behind my father's shoulder. I can still see him there, leaning against the carved oak doorway with one hand in the pocket of his tailored trousers, wearing the soft little smile of a man who had just watched his competition disappear without having to lift a finger. In the Whitaker family, daughters were polished, presented, and traded like rare silver. Sons inherited. Sons spoke at board meetings. Sons were forgiven before they apologized. And daughters, if they were useful, were arranged. My father owned Whitaker Maritime, a shipping empire that had made our family name heavy enough to open doors in every private club from Charleston to Washington, D.C. But when the market shifted and his debts began hiding under the rugs of our beautiful house like snakes, he did not look to Graham to save the company. Graham was the heir, the golden boy, the son whose mistakes were called lessons. No, Preston looked at me. He looked at his 18-year-old daughter and decided I was the cleanest asset he had left. The offer came dressed as a celebration. That evening, the dining room glowed with candlelight, and the table was set with china that had belonged to my great-grandmother. My father had invited Harrison Vale, the son of a defense investor whose family had enough money to steady Whitaker Maritime's failing expansion deal. Harrison was 29, smug, and already drunk by the second course. He spoke about women the way men like him spoke about yachts, admiring the shine and ignoring the soul. Every time he touched my wrist, I felt my spine lock. Across the table, my father watched me with warning in his eyes, silently commanding me to smile, to laugh, to play my role. Graham gave me a little wink as if the whole thing were a joke everyone understood but me. After dessert, Preston asked me to join him in his study. The room smelled of leather, cigars, and old money, the 3 things my father trusted more than God. He poured himself a drink, stood beneath the portrait of my grandfather in his Navy uniform, and told me the engagement announcement would be made within the month. Not asked, told. I remember staring at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for some sign that my father had not mistaken me for a contract. Instead, he slid a velvet ring box across the desk and said, "This family has given you everything, Elaine. Now it is your turn to give something back." I asked him if he was serious. He did not blink. I told him I would not marry Harrison Vale. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm at first, which was how I knew the real storm was coming. He said I was young, emotional, and spoiled by too many books and too much time with my grandmother Marianne, who had filled my head with dangerous ideas about independence. He said love was a luxury for people without responsibility. He said women in families like ours did not chase childish dreams. That was when I told him my dream was not childish. I told him I had already spoken to a Navy recruiter. I told him I wanted to serve. For 1 second, the room went so still I could hear rain tapping against the windows. Then my father laughed. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was small, cold, and final. "The Navy?" he said, like I had confessed to stealing from him. "You think you are going to put on a uniform and embarrass this family in front of every man who respects me?" I looked at the portrait behind him, at my grandfather's calm, painted face, and I said, "Granddad served." My father's expression changed. "Your grandfather was a man," he said. That sentence did not just insult me. It explained my entire childhood. Every closed door, every conversation I had been asked to leave, every time Graham was praised for breathing while I was criticized for wanting, I felt something inside me break cleanly, not in weakness but in release. I told Preston Whitaker that I would not marry Harrison Vale, not for his company, not for his reputation, not for any name carved above any gate. For the first time in my life, I watched my father realize he could no longer steer me by fear alone. He moved fast then. Not with fists, not with shouting at first, but with the efficient He opened drawers, pulled out papers, my 2 canvas bags were packed badly by someone who wanted me gone more than they wanted me clothed. My books were left behind. My mother's necklace was missing. The photograph of my grandmother and me at the harbor had been shoved between shirts like trash. I followed him to the front hall in disbelief, still thinking some part of him might return to itself. But Graham was already there, arms crossed, watching. "Don't make it dramatic, Elaine," he said. "You always wanted to prove you were different." Preston opened the door, and the storm rushed in so hard the chandelier above us trembled. He threw the first bag onto the driveway. It hit a puddle and split open, spilling clothes into the mud. The second followed. Then he turned to me, and every servant, every shadow, every portrait in that house seemed to hold its breath. "You are no longer part of this family," he said. "You are a disgrace to the Whitaker name. You will crawl back when the world teaches you what you are worth, and when you do, this door will still be closed." I wanted to say something powerful. I wanted to wound him the way he had wounded me. But I was 18, and my whole life was lying in the rain. So I stepped outside. The stone was freezing under my feet. Behind me, Graham chuckled softly and said, "Good luck saluting strangers for minimum wage." Then the door slammed, and the lock turned. That sound followed me longer than the thunder. I stood there until my hair stuck to my face and my dress clung to my skin, waiting for the pain to become rage, waiting for rage to become direction. I do not know how long I stayed on that driveway. I only know that at some point I stopped looking at the door and started looking at the road. I gathered my muddy clothes, zipped what I could into the bags, and walked away from the only home I had ever known. Charleston at night in a storm looks like a city made of ghosts. All iron gates, and slick pavement and yellow windows glowing with lives that still had somewhere to belong. I had $17 in my pocket, no phone Preston would not cut off by morning, and no plan except not to turn around. At the end of the long private road, under the weak shelter of an old gas station awning, I opened the envelope my grandmother Marianne had pressed into my palm earlier that week. She had known. Of course she had known. Inside were $300, folded around a note written in her careful blue script. "My brave girl, if they ever force you to choose between comfort and honor, choose honor. Comfort can be taken from you. Honor becomes your bones. The sea will teach you the rest." I read it once, then again, and the tears I had refused to give my father finally came, hot and silent, mixing with the rainwater on my face. Across the street, half hidden behind sheets of rain, a small Navy recruiting office still had one light burning in the window. I stared at that light until it stopped looking like a building and started looking like an answer. Then I picked up my bags, crossed the street, and stepped toward the door that would change everything. By sunrise, the girl my father had thrown into the rain no longer existed, but the woman replacing her had not yet learned how to stand without shaking. I walked into that Navy recruiting office with mud on the hem of my dress, rainwater dripping from my hair, and 2 canvas bags that looked like evidence from a crime scene. The petty officer behind the desk looked up from his paperwork, saw my bare feet, and for one brief second, his professional expression cracked into something dangerously close to pity. I hated that look more than I hated the cold. Pity was what rich people gave to strangers when they wanted to feel generous without becoming involved. Pity was what my father had said I would need for the rest of my life. So before the recruiter could ask if I was lost, I lifted my chin and said, "I want to join the United States Navy." My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to, but it did not break. He studied me for a long moment, then reached beneath his desk, pulled out a clean towel, and said, "Then sit down, miss. Let's find out how serious you are." That was the first kindness I received after losing my family, and maybe because it was not wrapped in softness, maybe because he did not ask me who had hurt me or why I had nowhere else to go, it felt like something I could accept. Within weeks, Charleston became a place behind me, a city of iron gates and sealed doors, and the Navy became the world in front of me, hard, loud, unforgiving, and honest, in ways my father's mansion had never been. Boot camp did not care that my last name had once opened private dining rooms. It did not care that I had grown up with silver flatware, Latin tutors, and a bedroom overlooking the harbor. The first morning, when a chief with a voice like a ship horn saw the name Whitaker stitched above my pocket, she raised one eyebrow and asked if I was related to Whitaker Maritime. I said yes before I knew better. By noon, half the division had decided I was a spoiled little heiress playing sailor until Daddy forgave her. They whispered that my hands were too soft, that my shoulders were too narrow, that girls like me cried when they missed brunch. One recruit from Ohio called me Princess Portside every time I struggled. Another asked if my maid had packed my sea bag. I wanted to tell them I had no maid now, no bedroom, no family waiting with open arms. But I had learned something important on the night Preston Whitaker locked the door behind me. Explaining your pain to people determined to mock it only gives them better weapons. So I stopped explaining. I folded my clothes until my fingers cramped. I ran until my lungs felt scraped raw. I learned to wake before the whistle, shine what needed shining, memorize what needed memorizing, and swallow every insult like seawater. Some nights I lay awake staring at the bunk above me, listening to other recruits breathe, wondering if my father had been right, wondering if I had mistaken stubbornness for courage. Then I would reach under my thin mattress, touch the folded note from my grandmother Marianne, and remember her words, "Honor becomes your bones." I did not understand them yet, but I carried them like a prayer. Marianne had been the only person in that old house who saw me clearly. When I was little, she would take me down to the harbor before sunrise and tell me the names of ships by silhouette alone. She said the sea did not respect bloodlines, only balance, skill, and nerve. She had been the one who slipped naval histories into my Christmas gifts while my father gave Graham cufflinks and business books. She had been the one who told me, after my mother died, that grief could either make a cage or a compass. For the first 3 months of training, her letters found me every other week, written in blue ink, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. She never said much about my father, never begged me to come home, never filled the page with anger. She wrote about the garden, about the tide, about how proud my mother would have been to know her daughter had chosen a life that required spine. I read every letter until the creases turned white. Then, without warning, the letters stopped. At first, I told myself she was tired. Then I told myself Preston had intercepted them. Then I told myself anything except the truth, because the truth had a weight I was not ready to lift. 2 weeks before graduation, a thin envelope arrived with Graham's handwriting on the front. My stomach turned cold before I opened it. There was no greeting inside, no warmth, no apology, just one page. Grandmother passed last Thursday. Father felt your presence would have been disruptive, given your choices. The funeral was private. Do not contact the house. I read it once standing beside my bunk, then again sitting on the floor. Then a third time after the words had stopped making sense. Last Thursday. Private. Do not contact the house. They had buried the only person who loved me, and they had not even given me the dignity of grief. For the first time since the driveway, I broke. Not loudly. Loud grief belonged to people who believed someone might come running. Mine folded inward. I locked myself in a bathroom stall, pressed Marianne's last letter to my mouth, and cried so hard I could barely breathe. That night, the uniform hanging from my locker looked like it belonged to someone braver. I took out a request form, stared at the blank lines, and convinced myself leaving was not surrender. I told myself I had joined because I had nowhere else to go. And now that Marianne was gone, maybe the last thread holding me together had snapped. I was halfway through writing my name when the door opened behind me. Chief Alvarez stepped into the room without knocking. She was a compact woman with iron gray hair, sharp eyes, and the terrifying ability to know when someone was falling apart from 3 hallways away. She looked at the paper, then at me, and said, "Whitaker, if that is a complaint about my training methods, make it poetic." I tried to smile, failed, and said, "I don't think I belong here." She crossed the room, took the form from beneath my hand, and read only the first line before setting it aside. "No," she said. "You don't think you deserve to survive what they did to you." I went still. I had never told her. I had never told anyone. Chief Alvarez pulled a folder from under her arm and dropped it on the desk. Inside were my evaluations, test scores, marksmanship records, leadership notes, every measurable thing I had earned while believing I was barely holding on. She tapped the top page. "You came here like a girl running from a locked door. But this file does not describe a runaway. It describes someone who listens under pressure, learns faster than prideful people, and does not quit when pain would give her an excuse." My throat closed. She leaned closer, her voice lower now, not gentle but steady. "Your family may have decided what you are worth in their house. They do not get to decide what you become in my Navy." Something in me shifted then, not healed, not whole, but anchored. I looked at Marianne's note beside my hand. "Comfort can be taken from you. Honor becomes your bones." I picked up the request form, tore it once, then again, and dropped the pieces into the trash. Chief Alvarez gave one short nod. like she had expected nothing less. 2 weeks later, I graduated with my division. No one from the Whitaker family came. No flowers waited. No proud father stood in the crowd. But when my name was called, Chief Alvarez stood at the back of the room and saluted me with 2 fingers against the brim of her cover. And for the first time since the storm, I understood that family was not always the people who kept your portrait on the wall. Sometimes it was the people who found you on the edge of quitting and reminded you that your story was not finished. The first time the Navy trusted me with lives, I understood that my father had never truly known what power was. Preston Whitaker had measured power in signatures, inheritance papers, private clubs, and men who lowered their voices when he entered a room, but out at sea, none of that mattered. The ocean did not care whose daughter I had been. It did not care that my family name was printed on shipping contracts from Charleston to Norfolk. It did not care that my brother Graham had inherited the warm office, the polished desk, and the easy applause. The ocean cared about whether you could read the wind before it turned against you, whether you could hear panic in a voice before it became a mistake, whether you could make a decision with incomplete information while steel groaned beneath your boots and every sailor around you waited to see if you were worth following. After graduation, I entered the Navy as if I were entering a second storm. Only this one did not throw me out. It stripped me down and rebuilt me. I learned navigation until the charts appeared behind my eyelids when I tried to sleep. I studied maritime security, communications systems, logistics chains, and tactical response until my classmates stopped asking why a Whitaker girl cared so much about things that could not be bought. There were still whispers, of course. There are always whispers when a young woman refuses to make herself small. Some said I was trying too hard. Some said I had something to prove. They were right, but not in the way they thought. I was not trying to prove myself to them. I was trying to prove to the girl on the driveway that she had not walked through that rain for nothing. Chief Alvarez's words stayed with me every time my hands blistered, every time an instructor corrected me in front of the room, every time a male officer smiled too politely and spoke too slowly, as if intelligence had to be softened for me. They do not get to decide what you become in my Navy. I repeated that sentence until it became less like encouragement and more like a command. Years passed in a blur of gray mornings, salt air, fluorescent briefing rooms, and the kind of exhaustion that leaves no room for self-pity. I earned my commission. I earned my first assignment. I earned the respect of people who had no reason to give it freely. And with every rank, every qualification, every sleepless night spent solving problems others had missed, the Whitaker mansion became smaller in my memory. Not harmless, never harmless, but smaller. Then came the deployment that changed how people looked at me. We were operating in a tense corridor of water where commercial shipping routes, foreign naval activity, and intelligence warnings overlapped like wires behind a wall. I was still young enough that some senior officers saw me as promising rather than proven, useful rather than essential. Our unit had been tracking a suspicious vessel, moving irregularly through a busy maritime lane, and every report carried the same quiet warning. Something about its course did not make sense. The weather had turned ugly by late afternoon. Rain hammered the deck so hard it seemed to bounce back upward, and the sky had that greenish, bruised color sailors learn not to ignore. Inside the operations center, the air was stale with coffee, stress, and too many bodies pretending they were not afraid of making the wrong call. I was assigned to monitor pattern analysis and communications flow, not to command the room. That distinction mattered to everyone except the emergency itself. The first failure came as a flicker on the screen, then a delayed transmission, then a second channel went unstable. A petty officer swore under his breath. Someone asked if it was atmospheric interference. Someone else said the satellite relay was still responding, but the data coming through was inconsistent. The suspicious vessel adjusted course again, cutting closer to a civilian tanker than any sane captain would risk in that weather. The officer in charge ordered a standard intercept recommendation based on the latest feed, but something in the numbers felt wrong to me. Not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong. The way a familiar song sounds wrong when one note is half a beat late. I leaned closer to the display and began comparing the live feed to the earlier track history. The timestamp drift was tiny, almost invisible under pressure, but it was there. Our system was not showing us where the vessel was. It was showing us where it had been minutes earlier, and in a crowded lane under bad weather, minutes were not delay. They were distance, collision, fire, bodies in the water. I said it once, clearly. No one heard me over the noise. I said it again, louder. A lieutenant near me snapped that we did not have time for theories. I felt the old heat rise in my chest, the same heat I had felt in my father's study when a man decided my voice was an inconvenience. But this time, I did not swallow it. I stepped forward, pointed to the pattern drift, and said, "Sir, if we follow that feed, we will send our response team to an empty patch of ocean and leave the tanker exposed. The data is lagging. The target is already south of the projected intercept." The room froze for half a second, which was the most time I was going to get. The commanding officer turned toward me with sharp eyes. "How sure are you?" he asked. My mouth went dry. Behind him, the map pulsed with bad information. Around me, men and women waited, some skeptical, some impatient, all of them aware that my answer might redirect the entire response. I thought of my father telling me I would crawl back when the world taught me what I was worth. I thought of Graham laughing about saluting strangers. Then I looked at the screen and trusted the skill I had bled to build. "Sure enough to put my name on it, sir," I said. He held my gaze for one brutal second, then gave the order to adjust. The next 10 minutes moved like a lifetime trapped inside a siren. Coordinates shifted, communications rerouted. The intercept team changed course. The civilian tanker was warned just in time to alter speed. Later, the official report would describe it in clean language. Communications, degradation, track latency identified, corrective routing executed, potential collision and security incident avoided. Reports always sound calmer than the people who survive them. What I remember is the silence afterward, when the updated radar finally confirmed what I had seen. The suspicious vessel was exactly where I said it would be. The tanker cleared the danger zone. The room that had nearly dismissed me now looked at me as if I had stepped out from behind a curtain. Nobody cheered. That is not how the Navy works in moments like that. But the lieutenant who had snapped at me came over later, stood awkwardly beside my station, and said, "Good catch, Whitaker." 2 words, that was all. Yet they meant more to me than every compliment I had ever heard inside my father's house, because this respect had not been inherited, arranged, or performed. It had been earned under pressure. After that, things changed. Not all at once, and not magically, but enough. People began asking for my read on problems before the room had already decided. Senior officers started sending me harder assignments. Younger sailors watched how I handled being underestimated and began standing a little straighter around me. I was still lonely in ways I did not admit, still carrying grief for Marianne like a folded flag inside my chest, but I was no longer rootless. The Navy had not replaced my family with softness. It had given me something better: purpose, standards, and people who judged me by what I did when the weather turned. Then, 3 months after that deployment, while we were in port, a legal envelope arrived from Charleston. I recognized the embossed firm name immediately. It was the same law office that had handled Whitaker Maritime's contracts for years. For one foolish second, I thought it might be about my grandmother's belongings. Maybe a letter she had left. Maybe the necklace my mother had worn. Maybe some final piece of home that Preston had failed to keep from me. Instead, the document informed me that Preston Whitaker had amended all family trust records to formally exclude me from any claim, inheritance, voting interest, property access, or archival family recognition connected to the Whitaker estate. The language was sterile, but the message was not. My father had not only thrown me out, he had gone back with a pen and made sure the paper world agreed I had never belonged. I read the document once, then folded it carefully and placed it in my locker beside Marianne's note. For a long time I stood there listening to the ship breathe around me. Then I did something that would have terrified the girl on the driveway. I smiled. If Preston wanted to erase me from his legacy, I would stop trying to survive as a missing branch from his tree. I would become something with roots of its own. That afternoon, I submitted my application for advanced officer training in maritime strategy and naval intelligence integration. The path everyone said was too competitive, too political, too demanding for someone without a sponsor. As I signed my name, Elaine Whitaker, I no longer felt the old ache beneath it. The name had been his once. From that day forward, I intended to make it mine. For the next decade, I learned how to become powerful without becoming loud. And that, more than any rank pinned to my uniform, was the thing my father would never have understood. Preston Whitaker had always announced power before entering a room. He wore it in expensive suits, in the heavy watch on his wrist, in the way he paused before answering a question so other people would remember they were waiting on him. The Navy taught me a different kind of power, The kind that moved through preparation, precision, and silence. I rose because I listened when arrogant people talked too soon. I rose because I studied after others slept. I rose because I knew what it felt like to be dismissed. And I refused to let that pain make me careless with anyone else. By my early 30s, I had served on deployments that took me from the Persian Gulf to the Pacific, from cramped briefing rooms lit by red lamps to command centers where one incorrect assessment could endanger an entire crew. I became known for seeing patterns before they became problems, for asking the question no one wanted to ask, for staying calm when the room filled with men twice my age trying to prove they were not afraid. I did not become beloved overnight. Women who lead rarely get that luxury. Some called me cold because I did not soften every correction with a smile. Some called me ambitious because I did not apologize for wanting responsibility. Some called me difficult because I would not let weak plans hide behind senior voices. But the sailors who worked with me knew the truth. I remembered names. I checked the maintenance notes no one thought mattered. I stayed until the youngest analyst understood why a decision had been made, not just what order had been given. I sent people home when exhaustion made them dangerous, and I took the blame when protecting a team mattered more than protecting my ego. Somewhere along the way, the Navy stopped being the place I had run to and became the place I was trusted in. The girl in the rain became Lieutenant Whitaker, then Commander Whitaker, then Captain Whitaker, and with each promotion, Charleston became less of a wound and more of a warning. I heard news about my family the way people hear weather reports from a country they no longer live in. Graham had joined Whitaker Maritime in a polished executive role created for him by our father. He gave interviews about legacy, leadership, and modernizing the family business, though the modernization mostly meant replacing competent people with friends from his private school network. Preston still appeared in society pages, still hosted charity dinners, still spoke about duty while refusing to understand it. Sometimes someone in naval logistics would mention Whitaker Maritime in passing, unaware that the name belonged to me in blood if not in loyalty, and I would feel the smallest pull in my chest, a thread from an old life trying to tighten. Then I would look at the officers around me, at the mission folders on my desk, at the sailors depending on my judgment, and the thread would snap again. My work eventually moved from shipboard operations into maritime intelligence integration, the kind of invisible machinery that keeps fleets alive before the public ever hears there was danger. It was not glamorous work to outsiders. No ballroom applause, no magazine covers, no engraved invitations. Just long days of classified briefings, interagency arguments, threat matrices, readiness reviews, and the constant awareness that if we did our job perfectly, most people would never know we had done anything at all. I liked that. There was purity in it. My father had needed witnesses for every performance of generosity. The Navy taught me that the most important work often left no fingerprints. By the time I was selected for flag rank, I had stopped imagining my father's reaction. I did not picture him reading the announcement. I did not wonder if Graham would choke on his coffee. Their disbelief was no longer the prize. The prize was the young lieutenant who pulled me aside after a briefing and said she had stayed in uniform because she saw someone like me at the front of the room. The prize was the chief who trusted me enough to disagree with me honestly. The prize was looking in the mirror and seeing not a daughter erased from a family trust, but a naval officer whose name carried weight because she had earned every ounce of it. Then Commander Olivia Park walked into my life carrying the same kind of quiet damage I recognized too well. She was brilliant, sharp-eyed, and younger than her resume made her seem, a rising officer in naval intelligence, with the rare ability to absorb chaos and return clarity. She had built a reputation for exposing weaknesses in information pipelines that senior people preferred not to discuss. That kind of talent saves lives, but it also threatens comfortable incompetence. When a classified reporting error embarrassed the wrong office, Olivia became the most convenient person to blame. The accusation was dressed in procedural language, as cowardice often is. Mishandled access, questionable judgment, possible disclosure risk. I read the preliminary file late one night in Norfolk, and by the third page I could smell a burial. Not justice, burial. The evidence against her was thin where it should have been strong and strangely polished where it should have been messy. Someone had built a box around her and expected her to stand still inside it. I requested the full audit trail. Twice, I was told it was unnecessary. The third time, I stopped asking and made it an order. What came back told the story clearly enough. Timestamp gaps, supervisory overrides, missing context, and a chain of responsibility that curved away from Olivia toward people with heavier titles and better protection. I called her into my office before the formal board convened. She stood at attention like a person prepared to be executed with courtesy. I asked her one question: "Did you do what they are accusing you of?" Her eyes did not waver. "No, ma'am." I believed her, not because she sounded innocent, but because I knew the sound of someone who had already accepted that truth might not be enough unless someone with power decided to care. At the review, I did not raise my voice. I laid out the evidence page by page until the room grew uncomfortable with its own silence. One captain tried to redirect the discussion toward Olivia's pattern of assertiveness, and I looked at him long enough for the phrase to die on the table. "Assertiveness is not misconduct," I said. "And competence is not insubordination simply because it embarrasses the careless." By the end of that day, Olivia Park's career was not only saved, the people who had tried to use her as a shield were under investigation themselves. She came to my office afterward and tried to thank me, but her voice broke before she finished. I told her what Chief Alvarez had once given me in a different form. The Navy does not get stronger by sacrificing its best people to protect its weakest habits. She saluted me then, crisp and trembling, and I returned it, never imagining that one day she would do the same in a room full of people who had once believed I was nothing. A year later, I was at my desk in Norfolk reviewing a defense modernization proposal when my aide brought in a cream-colored envelope addressed by hand. The return name froze me before I opened it. Clara Whitaker. My niece. Graham's daughter. I had not seen her since she was a child with ribboned hair hiding behind a staircase at one of Preston's Christmas parties. Inside was an invitation to a Navy League gala in Washington, D.C., followed by a short note that felt less like etiquette and more like a flare fired into the dark. "Aunt Elaine, I know they told me you abandoned the family. I no longer believe them. I am engaged to Commander Olivia Park, and this gala matters to her, to me, and maybe to the truth. Please come. I think you may be the only honest person with our name." I sat there for a long time with the invitation in my hand, reading the final line again and again. At the bottom of the guest list were two names printed in elegant black ink: Preston Whitaker and Graham Whitaker. For 23 years, I had let silence protect my peace. Now silence was inviting me back into the room where their lies had lived without challenge. The invitation sat on my desk for 3 days before I touched it again, and that was how I knew it frightened me more than any classified briefing ever had. I had faced unstable regions, angry committees, failed systems, political pressure, and the kind of operational decisions that make sleep feel like something you borrowed from another life. But one cream-colored envelope from Clara Whitaker had found a door inside me I thought I had sealed shut. Washington, D.C. was not Charleston, and a Navy League gala was not my father's house. Yet the names at the bottom of that guest list made the old driveway appear in my mind with cruel clarity. Preston Whitaker, Graham Whitaker. 23 years had passed since they locked me out in the rain, and still some part of my body remembered the sound of that lock. I could have declined. No one would have questioned it. Rear Admirals are busy people. Polite excuses are easy to manufacture, but Clara's words kept returning to me. "I think you may be the only honest person with our name." That sentence did not ask me to attend a party. It asked me whether I was willing to let a young woman inherit the same lies that had once buried me. So on the evening of the gala, I chose the simplest navy blue dress in my closet, pinned my hair back without ceremony, and left every visible sign of rank behind. No uniform. No ribbons. No aide walking beside me. No official car pulling up like an announcement. I wanted to enter that room as they believed I was. An aging, forgotten daughter in a plain dress, invited only because one compassionate niece had made a sentimental mistake. If Preston and Graham had changed, I would see it. If they had not, I would see that too. The hotel ballroom in Washington glittered with the polished confidence of people who were used to being photographed from their best angle. Crystal fixtures threw clean white light over round tables dressed in silver and deep blue, while models of naval vessels gleamed inside glass cases along the walls. Officers in dress uniforms moved through the crowd with senators, defense executives, donors, journalists, and retired commanders whose names carried weight in rooms like that. Waiters passed champagne beneath banners honoring maritime service, national security, and the future of naval leadership. It should have felt like my world. In many ways, it was my world. I had briefed some of the people in that room behind closed doors. I had challenged funding assumptions, protected programs, corrected intelligence gaps, and made decisions that affected more steel, sailors, and strategy than Whitaker Maritime had ever touched. Yet as I stepped inside in my civilian dress, holding a small clutch instead of a command folder, I felt the strange double vision of returning as both the woman I had become and the girl they had discarded. No one recognized me immediately. That was almost peaceful. I found a quiet place near a display of a new unmanned surface vessel and let the room reveal itself. Then I saw Clara. She stood near the stage in an ivory gown, her dark hair swept back, speaking with a composed young woman in navy dress uniform whose posture I recognized before I fully saw her face. Commander Olivia Park. For a second, the years collapsed in a different direction, back to my office in Norfolk, to her standing rigidly before me, while powerful people tried to turn her career into a shield for their own negligence. She was smiling now, not the careful smile of survival, but something fuller, steadier. Clara touched her sleeve with open affection, and Olivia looked at her as if the noise of the entire ballroom had faded. I felt something in my chest loosen. Whatever else happened that night, Clara had chosen someone real. I was still watching them when a voice behind me said, "Well, I'll be damned." I did not turn right away. I knew Graham's voice. Time had thickened it, given it the smooth confidence of a man who had spent decades being agreed with, but the cruelty underneath had aged perfectly intact. When I turned, my brother stood with a drink in one hand, an expensive boredom on his face. He was heavier than I remembered, his hair carefully darkened at the temples, his tuxedo tailored to conceal softness rather than express discipline. Beside him stood Preston Whitaker. My father was 81 now, though pride held him upright more firmly than bone. His silver hair was immaculate, his black tuxedo severe, his mouth already bending with recognition and displeasure. For one brief moment, neither of them spoke. They looked at my dress first, then my face, then my hands, searching for signs of failure like men inspecting cargo for damage. Graham recovered first. "Elaine," he said, drawing out my name as if it amused him. "Clara mentioned she had invited you, but I assumed you would have enough sense not to come." Preston's eyes narrowed. "Apparently sense was never your strongest quality." There it was. Not shock, not regret, not even curiosity. 23 years, and they had not wondered who I had become. They had only waited for evidence that I had become what they predicted. I took a slow breath and let it pass through me without landing. "Good evening, Preston," I said. His jaw tightened at the absence of father. Graham chuckled into his glass. Still dramatic, still pretending dignity is a personality. He glanced around the ballroom as if checking who might be listening, then lowered his voice just enough to appear private while making sure the nearby guests could hear every word. "You do realize this is a donor and leadership event, not a place for family ghosts to wander in looking for closure." Preston stepped closer. The scent of his cologne was the same expensive cedar I remembered from his study. And for one dizzy second I was 18 again, watching rain spill across the marble threshold. "Clara has a soft heart," he said. "Too soft. Olivia's military background has filled her head with sentimental nonsense about resilience and redemption. But let us not embarrass ourselves by pretending you belong here." A few people near the display had gone quiet. I saw a retired officer glance toward us, uncertain whether he was witnessing family tension or something worse. Graham smiled at him apologetically, the way Whitaker men always apologized to witnesses instead of victims. "My sister had every advantage," he said, performing sorrow now. "Education, family, opportunity. But some people are determined to turn privilege into grievance." Preston looked me up and down again, and this time his voice sharpened into the exact blade I remembered. "You were invited because Clara pities you. Nothing more. Do not mistake a young woman's kindness for status. This room is filled with people who built things, led things, mattered to something larger than their own resentment. You do not belong among accomplished people, Elaine. You never did." The words reached for the old wound but found scar tissue instead. I thought of Chief Alvarez. I thought of Olivia standing before a review board, nearly destroyed by cowards with cleaner titles. I thought of every sailor who had trusted my judgment in weather, darkness, and danger. Then I looked at my father, this small old man wrapped in a tuxedo and borrowed importance, and I felt no need to prove myself to him. I lifted the glass of water I had taken from a passing tray, held his gaze, and said quietly, "Maybe by the end of tonight, you'll understand what accomplishment actually looks like." Graham laughed, but it came out too quickly. Preston's eyes flashed, and I knew he was preparing another cut when the lights dimmed over the tables. A gentle chime sounded through the ballroom, and the master of ceremonies announced the evening's formal remarks. Guests began turning toward the stage. Preston straightened instantly, rearranging his face into public nobility. "Try not to create a scene," he murmured, as if I had been the one humiliating him. I said nothing. The stage lights brightened. Clara stepped forward first, thanking everyone for attending, her voice graceful but charged with nerves. Then she turned toward Olivia, and the room applauded as Commander Park approached the microphone in her dress uniform. Preston's expression softened into satisfaction, as though Olivia were another ornament newly attached to the Whitaker name. Graham leaned toward me and whispered, "Watch carefully. This is what respectable service looks like." Olivia placed both hands on the podium, looked over the crowd, and began with a few measured words about duty, truth, and the people who protect others without asking to be seen. Then her eyes moved across the room and stopped on me. Her entire face changed. The prepared speech fell silent beneath her fingertips. Slowly, with the precision of instinct and memory, Olivia stepped back from the microphone, turned her body fully toward the rear of the ballroom, brought her heels together, and raised her right hand in a crisp, flawless salute directly at me. Around us, conversation died. Graham's smile vanished. Preston went perfectly still, and in the sudden silence of that glittering room, everyone began turning to see who Commander Olivia Park was saluting. For 3 seconds after Olivia Park saluted me, the entire ballroom forgot how to breathe. I saw it happen in waves, the confusion moving from face to face as senators, donors, admirals, executives, and polished society guests turned away from the stage and followed the line of her raised hand toward the back of the room, toward the woman in the plain navy blue dress standing beside a glass case of ship models with a water glass in her hand and 23 years of silence behind her. Preston's face did not change at first. That was the remarkable part. My father had spent his life training his features to survive bad news in public, and for one brief moment, pride held him together like wire around cracked porcelain. Graham looked from Olivia to me and then back again, his mouth half open, as if his mind had reached for an insult and found nothing solid enough to throw. Olivia did not lower her salute. She stood at attention beneath the stage lights, her dress uniform immaculate, her voice steady when she returned to the microphone without taking her eyes off me. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and the speakers carried her words to every corner of that glittering room. "Please stand for Rear Admiral Elaine Whitaker, the officer who saved my career, protected the truth when silence would have been easier, and helped safeguard more lives at sea than most of us will ever know." The title struck the room harder than a shout. Rear Admiral Elaine Whitaker. I watched recognition ignite in places I had not expected it. A retired vice admiral at the front table rose first, his chair sliding back against the marble floor. Then a deputy secretary I had briefed twice stood with his hand over his heart. A senator turned toward me with startled respect, then lifted his glass. Uniformed officers stood next, not because someone had told them to, but because they understood what Olivia had just done. In the military, a salute is never decoration. It is a language. It says rank, respect, memory, duty. It says, "I know who you are." Within moments, the whole ballroom was on its feet. Applause rose slowly, then gathered force until it rolled against the crystal chandeliers and shook loose every lie my father had ever told about me. I did not move at first. Not because I was shocked, but because I wanted to remember it exactly. Olivia's hand still at her brow, Clara crying openly beside the podium, officers I respected standing in acknowledgement, and Preston Whitaker, the man who had once thrown my bags into the rain, forced to watch a room full of the very people he worshipped, honor the daughter he had erased. His color drained so completely that the harsh ballroom light made him look carved from ash. Graham stepped back as if the applause itself had heat. Around them, the guests who had overheard their cruelty minutes earlier began to understand what they had witnessed. I saw one executive whisper to his wife. I saw the retired officer near the display look at Preston with open disgust. I saw Clara stare at her grandfather, not with anger, but with the devastation of a young woman realizing the family stories she had inherited were not merely incomplete, but deliberately cruel. Olivia finally lowered her salute only after I gave the smallest nod. The applause continued. I could have walked to the stage then. I could have taken the microphone, told them about the driveway, the rain, the locked door, the funeral I was not allowed to attend, the trust papers that erased my name, the way Graham laughed when I had nowhere to go. I could have dismantled Preston Whitaker in front of every donor and official whose approval he had spent the evening chasing, but standing there, surrounded by the sound of recognition I had not asked for, I realized I did not want revenge. Revenge would have tied me to him one more time. Truth had already done enough. When the applause softened, Preston moved toward me with the stiff urgency of a man watching his empire catch fire in a crowded room. Graham followed, pale and sweating, no longer amused. "Elaine," Preston said, and for the first time in 23 years, my name sounded useful in his mouth. "Elaine, we didn't know." I looked at him calmly. That was the first lie. They had not known my rank, my record, my authority, but they had known enough. They had known I was a daughter left outside in a storm. They had known I was a granddaughter kept from a funeral. They had known I was a sister, mocked for choosing service over obedience. They had known the shape of their cruelty. Only the consequences had surprised them. Preston reached for my arm, but I stepped back before his fingers touched me. His expression flickered, offended even in disgrace. "This is extraordinary," he said quickly, forcing a smile for the people still watching. "A Rear Admiral, my daughter. We should have been told. We should talk privately. There is so much to repair, and with your position, with your connections, perhaps Whitaker Maritime and the Navy—" "Stop," I said. Not loudly. I did not need volume. The word cut cleanly through him. Graham swallowed. Preston's mouth closed. I looked past them for a moment, toward Clara and Olivia, now stepping down from the stage, toward the officers who had returned to their seats but not to indifference, toward the room where my father's version of me had just died in public. Then I looked back at Preston. "You are not sorry you threw me away," I said. "You are sorry important people found out what you threw away." His face tightened, and there he was again, the old Preston beneath the trembling apology, furious not because he had hurt me, but because he had lost control of the story. "You are still my daughter," he said, almost pleading now, almost commanding. I thought of Marianne's note, worn soft from years of being unfolded. "Comfort can be taken from you. Honor becomes your bones." I thought of Chief Alvarez standing at the back of a graduation room when no family came. I thought of Olivia, nearly sacrificed by cowards, now standing beside the woman she loved with her name intact. "No," I said gently. "You spent 23 years proving I was not your legacy. Tonight only proved I never needed to be." Preston stared at me as though I had struck him. Graham whispered my name, but it carried no power anymore. I turned away from them and walked to Clara. She met me halfway, trembling. And when she hugged me, it was not the polished embrace of a society event. It was desperate, honest, young grief breaking free from inherited lies. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I held her tightly and said, "Do not apologize for crimes committed before you knew the truth. Just promise me you will never let anyone call control love." Olivia stood beside us, eyes bright but posture steady. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. I smiled at her. "You already thanked me once, Commander. Tonight you gave the truth a microphone." A few minutes later, I left before dessert, before donors could swarm me, before Preston could attempt another performance of regret. Outside, Washington's night air was cold and clear, nothing like the storm that had swallowed me at 18. The hotel doors closed behind me, and for the first time in my life, leaving a room with my family inside did not feel like exile. It felt like freedom. I had spent years thinking healing would arrive as an apology, a confession, a father finally understanding the daughter he had broken. But healing came quieter than that. It came when I no longer needed him to understand. It came when the life I built became louder than the life he denied me. So if you have ever been underestimated, erased, mocked, or pushed out by the people who should have protected you, remember this: their blindness is not your identity. Keep building. Keep serving your purpose. Keep walking toward the door that opens instead of begging at the one they locked. And if this story stayed with you, share where you are watching from in the comments. Tell me whether you would have revealed the truth sooner or waited for the perfect moment. And stay with me for the next story, because sometimes the quiet person in the back of the room is the one everyone should have saluted from the beginning.